Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our first seminar of the spring semester. Today, I'm very happy to introduce Professor Santino, Salvador Santino Regilme from Leiden University. Professor Regilme is a prolific scholar and has produced important works on foreign aid and human rights, much debated topic in international relations. And today, he will present his work from his forthcoming book titled Aid Imperium, United States Foreign Policy and Human Rights in Post-Cold War Southeast Asia, which will be published at the University of Michigan Press. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Regilme.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity. Before I start, I'd like to thank Professors Sung Eun Kim, Professor Shinwa Lee, and Professor Jae Hyuk Shin for this opportunity, and also to Junwo Si, the student assistant, and all of you for being with me today to listen to my presentation. So the title of this presentation is really comes from the title of the book, Aid Imperium, which is a forthcoming book from the University of Michigan Press in its book series, Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. This is actually the culmination of my first book project that emerged from my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation, half-decade ago. I moved on to several other projects, but this is something that is close to my heart. I originally came from Southeast Asia, from the Philippines. I was born and raised in Manila. And as we all know, the Philippines is one of the key mutual defense treaty allies of the United States. Like South Korea, the Philippines holds very close bilateral relations with the United States, which is still the most dominant state actor in the post-World War II international system. Just an outline for today's talk. I believe I'll be speaking for around 40 minutes or so. Is that correct? But please feel free to cut me off if I exceed the time constraints. The outline of my talk will consist of 5 parts. The first part will just to contextualize the broader problem of foreign aid and diplomacy as well as human rights. The second part of my presentation really focuses on the puzzle. What is this puzzle that motivates me to understand this relationship between domestic state repression and perhaps the impact of United States foreign aid and how it interacts with other variables? The third part of my presentation is the presentation of my theory, which is the interest convergence theory, which basically explains this relationship between foreign aid and human rights. And I do think that this theoretical framework can be used not only to understanding the human rights situation in the Philippines and Thailand, which are the 2 country cases for this study, but also in other country cases in which these countries have very close bilateral relations with the United States. The fourth one is that I'll focus on one of the chapters or one of the cases in the book. The book is around 330 pages, but basically one of the chapters, there are several cases and I'll present that later, but I'll just only focus on one case here just because of time constraints. Finally, I'll conclude this presentation by reflecting on how we can understand United States foreign aid and how it actually impacts state repression and political transformation in many other places beyond Southeast Asia and many other places in the global South. Just a review, and I think most of us here in the virtual room, so to speak, are very familiar, especially I can imagine in this audience in South Korea. The United States is by far the largest single foreign donor government with more than 200 recipient countries. South Korea is a donor country too. And most recently, China is becoming the second most dominant state actor in the international development. I recently published an article in the International Spectator comparing United States and Chinese foreign aid. But based on the latest count, the United States remains to be the most dominant state actor for foreign aid disbursements. US foreign aid, however, faces severe challenges under the Trump administration. You can see that Trump wasn't interested at all in providing economic aid to many countries. For example, the Trump administration during his time pulled out American membership in the World Health Organization and in many other constituent agencies within the United Nations. This was very critical. This was very detrimental, in fact, to the various humanitarian aid projects of the United Nations, as well as many other countries in the sub-Saharan or in the African continent that actually depend on United Nations aid. And we all know that the United States it remains to be one of those key state donors within the UN budget. However, we can see that under the Biden administration, Biden committed during the campaign for reinvigorating the importance of foreign aid as an instrument of diplomacy and as an instrument of projecting US power in many places beyond the American territory. And you can see this we're just now in the second or third month of the Biden administration. And what's so crucial here is that Biden already nominated a high profile key figure for the USAID. So the USAID is the main agency for aid disbursements. It's a federal government under the executive branch, under the White House. And Biden nominated Samantha Power. Samantha Power is a key figure in the foreign policy strategies of the Obama administration. And Samantha, this was a crucial appointment in the part of Biden, primarily because USAID administrators are usually low-profile bureaucrats that have been there in the USAID bureaucracy for decades. But putting a very prominent public figure in the person of Samantha Power, who was the former US ambassador to the United Nations, signals a very important message on the part of the Biden administration. So you can see this fluctuation in support for USAID and for the importance of foreign aid diplomacy. What is so important, however, to understand is that regardless of this fluctuation that we saw during the Trump administration, there is widespread domestic support for foreign aid, particularly both for Republican and Democratic administrations. So there is a bipartisan support for foreign aid if we're talking about the long period of time. But it's also important is that the appeal of liberal human rights discourses appears to be declining. I'm not so sure, for example, if this might be the case in many other continents or perhaps in the context of Northeast Asia, let's say Japan or South Korea. But what we see, though, is that liberal human rights are being contested, highly contested, even by conservative and illiberal actors. Even Trump, for example, used the notion of human rights and weaponized it against China. And I'm not saying that Trump's criticism against China was wrong. What I'm just saying here is that human rights became powerful discursive tools in order for powerful actors to use human rights in order to project their geostrategic policies. What we see also is that this assault against human rights has been widespread in many parts of the global south. For example, Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines, Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, or even here in Europe, Viktor Orban in Hungary, for example, put a crucial assault against human rights and liberal democracy. This is very important because Hungary is part of the European Union, and you can see this assault on academic freedom even here in Europe. Putin in Russia, and of course, more recently with Donald Trump in the United States. Having said that, we see that perhaps there are two key pillars of United States diplomacy over time. You have foreign aid, which is the material resource, and you also have the diplomatic instruments. That includes human rights discourses, democracy promotion discourses, and basically justifying the importance of military and economic aid through those discourses. Now, the question of the book is the puzzle of the book is quite simple, but for me, it's intriguing. Does foreign aid undermine human rights in recipient countries? And if so, how and under what set of conditions does it impact human rights outcomes, particularly physical integrity rights? Now, when I talk about human rights here, I'm only focusing on physical integrity rights. That means to say it refers to the individual's freedom from torture, extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, and any other form of mental and physical harassment. Usually, I'm referring here to state violence against the individual bodily integrity. Why is that? I just focus here because it's something that is observable, empirically observable, and this is something that is one of the core tenets of human rights. This doesn't mean to say that I don't consider other types of human rights important, but just for the analytic purposes of this book, this is the reason why I focus on physical integrity rights. In the book as well, I use the term foreign aid when I refer to the quantifiable amount of foreign aid. Foreign aid can be seen, for example, in the USAID Green Book. So it records all forms of foreign aid disbursements over time, starting in the late 1940s until 2016. During the Trump administration, the USAID Green Book website was on shutdown. I haven't checked yet under the Biden administration if it's still active, but I focus on foreign aid if it refers to the material amount. However, I use the term more broadly, the term foreign strategic assistance in the book. And when I say foreign strategic assistance, this refers both to the material amount of foreign aid, which is something that we can see, we can quantify, we can actually observe through monetary amounts, but I also refer to the ideational element here. I refer to the ideational element of foreign aid. Most economists, and in the book, I put a quite extensive critical review of the literature, of the interdisciplinary literature on foreign aid, that most economists, macroeconomists, for example, and some foreign aid scholars think of foreign aid as if it's only about the material amount. And therefore, we can decipher its effects or transformative effects on recipient countries just by looking at the amount. What I argue, however, is that we also have to look into the ideational elements, and together they constitute two sides of the same coin. So when I say foreign strategic assistance, what are also the ideational discourses of both the donor and recipient governments, right? What kind of justifications, narratives, and excuses that they actually convey to their domestic constituents on why this foreign aid is important. I'll give you an example. For instance, during the 1990s, late 1990s, for example, this was the period of the end of the Cold War. So it's a post-Cold War era, the post-Cold War decade. The United States, there was a dramatic slump or decrease in military aid because most countries, and of course the United States, thought that there's no need to disburse a large number of military aid. Obviously, despite the end of the Cold War, the United States still provided military aid in many countries worldwide. Now, the question there is, even if the United States is providing military aid, the question there is, how is this military aid being used? And this question of how and why and how is it possible that military aid is being used for particular projects is a question of understanding what are the shared interests of the donor and recipient governments. For example, economic aid that is being used during the 1990s in the Philippines and Thailand and in many countries in the global south, what I figured is that they're being used primarily for democracy promotion projects, civil society aid, or public infrastructure projects that are largely used for stimulating economic development. And the Clinton administration, as well as in the countries in the global south, justified economic aid for economic development, because economic development can only be achieved through democracy promotion. Now, they also provided military aid, but it is very important that a lot of this military aid was really about institutionalization and professionalization of human rights awareness amongst the military institutions in recipient countries. Whereas after the Cold War, after the 9/11 attacks, in the post 9/11 era, you can see that even if it's economic aid, it was declared in the official records that it was about building public infrastructure. It was really public infrastructure for the military facilities of the United States in the conflict-prone regions in southern Thailand or in the southern Philippines. So you can see there that it is economic aid in the post 9/11 war on terror era, but it was subservient towards the overarching war on terror paradigm. I'll talk about that much later on. The key argument of my book is quite straightforward. I argue that donor and recipient governments, so the United States and the recipient governments, converging interests, together with the domestic legitimacy of the recipient government, so primarily shape the purposes of foreign aid and domestic policies, and that would have an impact on the level as well as the scope of domestic state repression and ultimately physical integrity rights. I'll show much later on an illustration of what are the different causal mechanisms that link foreign aid and human rights together. Simply put, what is the takeaway here? I argue that foreign aid is neither good nor bad. And I think this is a criticism both for post-colonial scholars and extremely anti-foreign aid scholars who argue that foreign aid is extremely bad. It is also criticism for scholars who argue that all forms of foreign aid are good. I argue that it's neither good nor bad. What foreign aid's impact is mediated instead through the shared interests of foreign and donor governments. So for example, it's really about those ideas, those justificatory narratives, those legitimating reasons about foreign aid that actually matter because those ideas will have a great impact on how foreign aid will be used in recipient countries. Just to tease out this puzzle, there are a lot of quantitative studies on foreign aid and human rights. I will not reiterate that here, but just to tease out the simple correlation between foreign aid. This is an aggregated result of PTS, or the Political Terror Scale, in the USAID Green Book. What it basically shows is that if the x-axis, so 1 to 5, 5 would be the number for countries that are extremely abusive. You can imagine North Korea, and countries would be 1 for the least abusive countries. Basically, what it shows is that countries over large periods of time, countries that are highly abusive, so usually this is 3. You can imagine Philippines, Thailand, Ghana, Kenya, Colombia, Pakistan, for example. These are not extremely abusive as North Korea, but abusive enough, right, to actually incite a lot of records of state violence in a particular country. They are the heavy recipients of United States foreign aid over time. And there are several studies implicating that there is a very strong correlation between these two countries. Obviously, for the purposes here, I only focus on Thailand and the Philippines because these are the 2 mutual defense treaty allies of the United States. Their militaries have been highly dependent on US foreign aid for a very long period of time. Now, the question here is, are they correlated? And if so, what are these plausible causal mechanisms that link the two? I think it's not wise to look only at the global, and it's important to select those countries that have been traditionally dependent on US foreign aid. So for example, I did not choose Bangladesh, for example, because Bangladesh also has a lot of donor countries, that are involved in Bangladeshi military and Bangladeshi economic development, one of which is the United Kingdom. So the importance of United States foreign aid might not be that crucial in that country case. So I only focus on Thailand and the Philippines because they are, for the longest period of time, the US has been a key actor in those states. This shows the amount of US military and economic aid. And during the 1990s, there was a dramatic slump. After the Cold War, the United States thought that there's no need to disburse large amounts of economic aid, but there has been a dramatic increase right after 2001 in the context of the global war on terror. Now I focus on civilian deaths, right? So civilian deaths caused by state violence would be the most concrete quantifiable data for physical integrity rights. So these are the number of deaths that were recorded because of extrajudicial killings, torture, enforced disappearances that were purportedly committed by state agents, both in the Philippines and Thailand, from the period 1989 to 2016. What you see here is that there is a dramatic increase after 2000, in the 2000s. What I'd like to highlight here is that in the Philippines, that there was the increase was recorded much earlier in the late 1990s. That was because, if you're familiar, there was a time that we had a president. His name was Joseph Estrada. So he was a movie actor, but he was booted out in power in 2001. Joseph Estrada, when his legitimacy was being contested, he intensified the counterinsurgency campaign in Mindanao in southern Philippines in late 1999, even before the 9/11 global war on terror. And that received large amounts of US foreign aid, and that ultimately contributed to the increase in state violence. In the case of Thailand, it dramatically increased in 2003 because of the 2003 war on drugs that was implemented by Thaksin Shinawatra, who is now an ousted prime minister. So the data that I showed to you before came from the Uppsala Conflict Database Program, which I think is the world standard for measuring state violence all over the world. But I'm not contented with that. I also look into the domestic data, and the domestic data here comes from the human rights reports from the Philippine human rights organizations. And what you can see here was that even before Duterte came into power, there was already a preceding historical trajectory in which the Philippines had this kind of increased state violence, dramatically increased after 2001 during the Gloria Macapagal Arroyo administration. So let me present to you my theoretical framework for linking foreign aid and human rights. What I argue is that there are both material elements as well as ideational elements. So the first is really about the ideational process. I call this process as the strategic localization of discourses. This process involves both the donor and recipient governments, but it also involves primarily how donor recipient governments justify their foreign aid programs, right? There are two ways, and in the study later on, I'll show to you that there are two ways in which they justify this. First, during the post-Cold War era in the 1990s, it could be justified through a comprehensive range of non-militaristic strategies. So for example, there's public infrastructure development program, you have civil society aid, democracy promotion, and other forms of non-economic aid. They justify this and they strategically localize this as saying that we need democracy in order to stimulate economic development. I'm not saying that there is a direct correlation between the two, but I'm just saying here that this is how they strategically localize the importance of US foreign aid despite the end of the Cold War. What I also argue here is that the recipient government, so for example, the Philippines and Thailand, was very active. In most of the literature on foreign aid, it usually paints the recipient government as lackluster, passive, and just waiting for aid to come from the clouds or from air. I argue otherwise. I argue that recipient countries actively seek foreign aid and they even hire lobbyists in Washington, D.C. So in the book, I provided open source evidence or evidence coming from open sources that in fact, even before, so right after the 9/11 attacks, the Philippine and the Thai governments paid thousands of dollars through lobbying firms in Washington, D.C. to paint the picture that the long standing armed insurgency in southern Thailand and in the Philippines, southern Philippines, for example, where there is armed Islamic rebellion, for example, they actively lobbied that those armed Islamic rebel activities were operational linked to Al Qaeda, and therefore the Philippine and Thai governments deserve foreign aid. Later on, this was proven to be quite false because there's not enough evidence that there is a very close operational link. But this was crucial for the United States to provide foreign aid nonetheless. And that, I argue, is one of the key processes of strategic localization of discourses. These discourses are important for binding those interests. Donor government on the part of the United States felt that it was important to provide this foreign aid so that this armed terrorists on the eyes of the United States will not enter U.S. soil, and it will not harm the strategic interests of the United States in Asia. And on the part of the recipient government, for example, the Thai and the Philippine governments, they thought that we need this money in order to consolidate our legitimacy. Both the Thaksin and the Arroyo governments faced a lot of challenges amongst critical sectors within the society, and that aid was used together with domestic resources. This is what I call as resource mobilization in order to intensify state violence. And state violence can be targeted into two ways. The first one is selective political repression. This refers to targeted abuses against civilian activists, students, journalists, for example, who are very critical against the incumbent government in those recipient countries. So for example, I'll give you an example of some journalists or student activists who were killed. And I argue that this selective political repression is only present when the recipient government has very low levels of legitimacy. Selective political repression is non-existent if an incumbent government, a recipient government, enjoys high levels of legitimacy. The other causal process here is erroneous coercive state practices. These are collateral abuses. So for example, the military and police agents might only be interested in, in suspects who there's enough evidence to implicate them for armed rebellion. So I'm talking about, but they, instead of detaining, for example, or combating against these armed rebels, they actually misidentified a particular civilian. And that is an example of a collateral abuse. So for example, in the case of the United Kingdom, I cited in the book, there was this instance in which the case of Rizwan Sabir, he was a master's student of international relations in the 2000s. And he was detained and tortured by the British government simply because he was writing a thesis about armed Islamic rebels, about Al Qaeda. And that he was researching a lot via internet in the library of Nottingham. And basically that triggered intelligence authorities and he was detained. Basically, that is an example of collateral abuse. But we don't see examples of selective political repression in the United Kingdom or in other consolidated democracies. And I can also argue that this might be the case in South Korea, in which the incumbent government relatively enjoy high levels of legitimacy, that you don't see widespread state violence because of selective political repression. And ultimately, that will lead to the level and the scope of physical integrity rights abuses. Another question that you might ask for yourself is quite simple. How about if you take away foreign aid? There's no foreign aid, there's no donor government. Will there still be human rights abuses? I argue that regardless of those variables, there's still a long-standing problem with the culture of impunity. The judiciary can be easily bribed, the judicial institutions are weak, and you have military and police agents who can be easily subsumed by private interests. Oligarchs, for example, who can easily contract certain military and police agents for these state agents to kill, let's say, for instance, indigenous communities who are against a particular mining activity in the Philippines or Thailand. That is possible. That in fact happened. And regardless of foreign aid, you have this culture of impunity that generates human rights abuses on their own terms. Just to provide a preview of the different cases that I have in this study, there are 5 cases in the study. I'll only highlight here the case of post 9/11 Philippines, 2001 and 2009. For example, here, a country that has very strongly, let's say the time period, the Philippine government during the post-Cold War era in the 1990s enjoyed strong legitimacy, and the shared interest of both the foreign and donor countries was really about a comprehensive range of security interests. It was not only about militaristic interests, and that generated fewer human rights abuses and generally a fairly better human rights outcome in those countries. I think I only have a few more minutes. I think 5 or 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes, yeah.
5 more minutes. Okay. Yeah, so 10. Okay. So what is this aid imperium? I argue that aid imperium is really an asymmetrical relationship. Donor and recipient states are not on the same level. And I do think that the United States for a long period of time has justified foreign aid as something as beneficial to them. You can see this picture in the early 1900s. The Philippines was actually part of the United States through the Commonwealth together with Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Hawaii. Philippines was eventually separated from the United States after the Second World War, primarily because of a lot of reasons that I won't have the time to tell here. But essentially, this was justified through benevolent assimilation in different forms of charitable and philanthropic projects. But in fact, there was a strategic interest there. I argue that this contemporary foreign aid practices constitute the unequal power relations that refers to the dominant political entity, which is the United States, and it shapes the social political formations, norms, and material distributive politics of the subordinate states. It is mutually reinforcing because foreign aid also helps consolidate the recipient government, particularly the elites in those recipient countries. Not to say, in fact, that a lot of the vulnerable communities in those recipient countries may or may not benefit from foreign aid, depending on the circumstances. But what is so important here is that foreign aid does not only consolidate the elites in the donor country, but also the recipient government. Let me just provide you a preview of the case study on Arroyo's Strong Republic. You can see here pictures of the Arroyo administration and, President Arroyo with George Bush. Arroyo, so through this discourses, so the first step is strategic localization of security discourses. Arroyo said in 2002 that the war, and I quote, "The war on terrorism does not distinguish between ordinary terrorists and those espousing political ideology. We will wage war against criminals, terrorists, drug addicts, etc., and those who terrorize factors that provide jobs." You might think that this is quite benign, but in fact, this became an overarching statement that also included student activists who are not directly involved in armed rebellion, but student activists criticizing the Arroyo policies because of because of the increased counter-terror operations. And a lot of these student activists were killed were enforced, were forcibly disappeared by purportedly by state agents. But you see here that there are discourses that pave the way for that to happen. At the same time, you can see this converging interest. Bush provided very wide discretionary powers on the part of the Philippine government. And I quote Bush here: "I'm willing to listen to President Arroyo. I'm willing to work with her in any way that she wants to. We've had a discussion about Abu Sayyaf." So Abu Sayyaf is one of the armed Islamic rebel groups in southern Philippines. She's got a clear vision about how to fight Abu Sayyaf, and I let her speak for herself. You can see here that there is partial convergence. Bush was interested in armed Islamic rebels so that they will not terrorize or that they will not undermine American interests in the region. That was fine. And at the same time, on the part of Arroyo, it gave her resources as well as political support, right, to not only target armed state rebellion, but also any form of critical journalism or any form of critical political opposition against her regime. So this was the justificatory narrative that paved the way for this intensified state violence. Arroyo was even proud because of these discourses. It gave her a lot of resources. And I gave you a quote here from Arroyo. "When I first became president in 2001, I inherited a commitment of military assistance from the US of $1.9 million only. Today," that was in 2004, at the time that when she was speaking about it, "that American assistance to our military support is now $400 million and still counting. In other words, from $1.8 million as I entered the presidency, our security relationship with the United States is worth about $400 million and still counting." Still counting because we are now a major non-NATO ally of the US, and other assistance and priorities go with that. You can see here that those discourses, those words didn't stop with mere pronouncements. There were a lot of material resources that came into the Philippine state coffers that made domestic state violence plausible. What happened here? The top three biggest recipients of US aid, for example, in 2004, came to the military agencies. The first one came to the Central Intelligence Service, $6 million, police, $8 million, and the Intelligence Coordinating Agency of $5.9 million. What you have to remember too is that unlike in the 1990s, a large number of foreign aid in post 9/11 Philippines were classified as confidential. That means to say that they were shielded from any form of congressional investigation on how they're being used. And this provided the executive branch blanket powers on how that aid will be used. Arroyo also used foreign aid as well as the political support from the United States to buy the political loyalty of the military. Remember my argument that if the recipient government has a low level of legitimacy, then he or she is able to increase state violence. And you can see it here. Arroyo was very afraid of a potential coup. So what she did was that she wanted to win the support of the military, and she wanted to weaken all forms of political opposition. So the second one, you can do that by increasing domestic state violence. Detain critical journalists, detain student activists, detain professors who keeps on speaking against her. But the first one is quite difficult. How do you win the support of the military? You can do that by appointing generals in the civilian bureaucracy. And that's what exactly she did. That's what exactly she did during her term. Arroyo appointed 12 generals to the position of chief of staff of the AFP during her 10-year term. And this was, in fact, she holds the record of having the largest number of cabinet officials, so cabinet would be ministers, and high-level diplomatic posts assigned to retired military, police, and police officers. This is the same story that I actually uncovered also with Thaksin during his time in Thailand. Despite that, Arroyo presidency registered consistently low levels of public support since the return of electoral democracy in 1986. Just one, I think this would be my second to the last or third to the last slide. Apologies for that. One example of how this aid was used for state violence is the example of Maguindanao massacre. The Maguindanao massacre, if you Google this or you can perhaps check on YouTube, Maguindanao massacre was dubbed by the Time magazine as the world's single worst attack at the time on journalists ever recorded. 57 unarmed men and women, 30 of them were journalists. Maguindanao massacre happened in the province of Maguindanao in southern Philippines. These were journalists who were covering the convoy of an opposition leader against the ruling Ampatuan clan. So Ampatuan is the family name of the ruling clan in that province, and the Ampatuan is closely allied to the Arroyo regime. When after the killings, a few weeks after the killings, there was an independent investigation by the Philippine government. And what they found out in the Ampatuan mansion, so the mansion of the family, was that there was a big weapons cache consisting of a lot of military weapons. And what they even found out here, sorry, I wanted to go back to what they found out here were a lot of M16s and different types of military weapons that bears the mark of U.S. Department of Defense. This is a smoking gun evidence on how you can see the transfer of military resources from Manila, also to the political families allied to the sitting government in Manila, through political clans in those provinces that have very good relations with the Arroyo government. The pictures on the left side, the one with the soil and with the tractor shows those bodies, right, that were being excavated because of the Maguindanao massacre. Another example, so it's not only about selective political repression. Let's assume that Arroyo had high levels of legitimacy. What I argue is that there will still be a lot of collateral abuses. And this is an example of how the collateral abuses of intensified counterterrorism generated a lot of these abuses. So a lot of the abuses happen in the south of the Philippines because this is where the armed Islamic rebel groups are concentrated. So even if the counterfactual there is that let's assume and think for a moment that Arroyo had high levels of legitimacy, there's no need to kill journalists, critical student activists. If that is the case, you still have the problem of armed Islamic rebellion, and that will stimulate intensified counter-terror operations, and you will still generate a lot of people who will be displaced because of infighting between the armed rebel groups and government forces. And a lot of these violence happen in southern Philippines. So I'd like to close this presentation by saying that increased foreign strategic support from the United States induce human rights deterioration if their shared interests converge on a counter-terror agenda and the recipient government has a weak domestic legitimacy. In order for us to improve foreign aid outcomes in the future, what is important is that foreign aid should also target the development and the professionalization of the judiciary, as well as the state security apparatus. What I saw in the cases of the Philippines and Thailand can be seen also in Colombia, for example, Pakistan and Kenya, and I also discussed this in my book towards the end. What is important in understanding foreign aid would be understanding both its discursive conditions, its discursive justifications, as well as the scope of its material dimensions. And with that, I'd like to end this presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Now, we'd like to have some discussion sessions with the audience. So if you have any questions or comments or suggestions, please use the raise the hand button and then ask questions. Oh, yeah, Professor Hanju Kim.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm sorry, but I have to leave at 5. I have other meetings, so I'll go first. One of the questions that I have is about the whole model that you suggested. And then especially the first one, which you call as ideational factors, and then the discursive one. How I see that model is that it seems like that in the very first phase where the recipient country and donor countries are coming up with a certain discursive dialogue at the local level, and then try to build, build intentions. It seems like there's a lot there, So the human rights violation, and then the repression, and then the use of the military aid, and then kind of exacerbating the existing situations, seem like all built in the very first discursive part. So I think whether that, my understanding of your model, where that intention to commit the human rights violation, or the using the human rights violation to gain the legitimacy, was already there in the first phase, or is it something that can be really facilitated throughout the process in your model, or can be also something that can be catalyzed, with this kind of money or the aid. So that I'm a little confused. So can you clarify that? Thank you.
Shall I answer already? Or okay, yeah. Thanks a lot for the question. What I argue here in the book is that indeed foreign aid generates this amplification effect, right? That means to say that let's do the counterfactual exercise and assume that the United States or the 9/11 terror attacks did not happen. And I discuss these counterfactual scenarios in each of the country cases in the book. Let's assume that the war on terror did not happen. Arroyo has a low level of legitimacy. She will still do the state violence, but I would argue that they will be quite limited. And the domestic state resources will be strained so much that a lot of those resources will be used for state violence. So I agree with you. Indeed, it exacerbates, and I call this, and economists in fact call this amplification effect. So the argument of aid imperium is about understanding how foreign aid's impact is mediated through various domestic variables. This is the causal story that I offer here. And I think this is a good intervention because when I read a lot of these economic literature, and to some extent literature in the social sciences and sociology, the understanding of foreign aid is really about how foreign aid does this or that without looking into a constellation of how transnational and domestic conditions interact with each other. So I agree with you. We are on the same boat here that indeed it bolsters that. And it's probable the case. It's probable that without the US during the Arroyo administration, China would have stepped in. And in fact, that was the story. In late 2007 to 2008, Arroyo, so the US Congress faced a lot of criticism saying that we should stop or reduce foreign aid to Arroyo because of abuses. There was a congressional investigation. What Bush did was only a reduction of around $2 million, which was nothing, right? But what Arroyo did was that she also had a lot of business contracts during the end of her administration with China. And without the US, probably China came in much earlier. And Arroyo, I think for the South Korean audience here, what's so interesting is that Duterte, the current administration, have very close ties with the Arroyo administration. And the China link could also be possible, was also facilitated probably in the latter years of the Arroyo regime. So indeed, the transnational factor exacerbated or amplified the domestic conditions.
Okay, thank you for the question and response. Then we'll move to next questions. Yes, Professor Shinha Lee.
Thank you. Thank you for your interesting speech, and congratulations on the upcoming publication by the Michigan University Press. I have a two kind of question, combination of question and comment. The first of all, you said the US foreign aid, either as a foreign aid itself or foreign, what do you call, strategic assistance, right? As you know, in order for US to maintain its hegemonic status or leading role in the world, they have no choice but to provide the global public goods. So as far as I understand, when it comes to US foreign aid, is very closely related to their capability or intent of how and how much they can provide the global public good to where and what area. So I was wondering, when you, in the very beginning, when you're talking about foreign aid in two terms, number one for foreign strategic assistance vis-a-vis foreign aid, what's on your mind when you're designing your research? Because I don't think it was much clear about it. And my second either question or comment is, you said your book was talking about, I'm sure mainly in the Philippines, in your home country, but also Thailand. But I don't think I clearly understand, probably it was my ignorance, what kind of comparative analysis you would like to make when you're talking about Philippines and Thailand. The reason I'm asking you is because in the case of Thailand, the US can benefit from Thailand by aiding to them is more likely for the investment and economy, because they said that country have abundant resources and etc. That's why probably they making a FTA in long time ago, at least more than 15 years ago, right? But on the other hand, in the case of Philippines, they're a strong ally, political strong ally I'm talking. So of course they're having an economic issue as well, but it's mainly for political security. So as far as I understand, the more recently, the Philippine president Duterte kind of a blackmail that they will kind of quit or like destabilizing their security pact with the US unless the US give a more foreign aid. And he was complaining the US give more aid to Pakistan rather than the Philippines, which is their ally, right? So I think what kind of a level of analysis or level of case analysis or selection you can project in your book. I'm sure you have more details since you don't have much time to talk when you're making a difference between Thailand and the Philippines, while I don't think their end state objective is different.
Thank you so much for the reaction, and these are very helpful and constructive comments. So the first one is regarding foreign aid and foreign strategic assistance. What was the justification for that, considering the case that the United States distributes foreign aid as a form of a global public good? Here, I disagree with the notion of aid as a public good. I argue that foreign aid is a club good. Laura Ann Viola, in her book, The Closure of the International System, published last year by Cambridge University Press, differentiates this in much detail in chapters 1 and 2 between a public good, which most IR scholars misconstrue with the notion of club good. I argue that foreign aid is a club good because not everyone benefits from them. Only those countries that receive foreign aid benefits from that as a way of enjoying this club, right? I mean, the United States doesn't give aid to countries that are antithetical to their values or somehow highly critical, although they use foreign aid to buy the loyalties of those countries. And this is what's happening in the Duterte administration. The difference between foreign aid and foreign strategic assistance, the only reason why, one of the key reasons why I use the term foreign strategic assistance when I also refer to to foreign aid plus diplomacy. It's because I'm offering here an analytically eclectic argument. So Katzenstein talks about this approach in IR about analytic eclecticism. What does that mean? I highlight here the importance of a realist argument, the importance of material resources, foreign aid, for example. This is Morgenthau's argument that foreign aid is buying the political loyalty of recipient governments, right? It's a principal agent relationship. But at the same time, I don't stop with that. I argue that how and under which conditions those material resources will be used will depend on the shared interests of the donor and recipient countries. And how do we measure that? We measure that through the discourses of US foreign diplomacy, but as well as the government discourses of the recipient governments. And together, that aggregate concept, right, both material as well as ideational, is what I call as foreign strategic assistance. So this was my justification in the book, that in most of the foreign aid literature, they only stop at looking at the numbers without looking into how those foreign aid resources were justified. And the justifications are crucial for me in the story that I offer. The second is about what is the comparative rationale for Thailand and the Philippines? Because it seems that Thailand, the U.S. reasons, the United States justifies its relationship with Thailand through investment, whereas this might be different in the case of the Philippines. I do think that the only reason why I wanted to focus on Thailand and the Philippines, it's because of the comparative logic here. Both Philippines and Thailand share a lot of similarities. Both are middle income countries. Both have been mutual defense treaty allies. Both have fairly stable constitutional democracies during that time that I covered. You can see that I did not include country cases from Thailand after 2006. It's because after 2006, you have succeeding military juntas and constitutional instabilities in the region. I also did not include the Duterte administration in the Philippines, because whether or not it is constitutionally democratic, right? But you can see that there's a democratic backlash. So this complicates the picture. And also the influence of the US during the Duterte administration is no longer apparent. So it wasn't good for comparative reasons. I argue that both in Thailand and the Philippines, during the 1990s, the reasons, all those details will be quite different, but the overarching story here was that both Thailand and the Philippines experienced democratic, how would I say this? They entered a new phase of democratization. After the Black May incident in Thailand, you have a new prime minister through the Democrat Party that came into power. And you also have the Ramos administration that came into power in the Philippines. Both of them have strong levels of legitimacy, but they also need external support. And they argued that their economic development program, this was also the period of the Washington Consensus and neoliberalization, but they argued that all these economic programs were needed can only be done, they can only be achieved if we strengthen our democracy. And this democracy consolidation part, or democracy promotion part, was supported by the United States. The Clinton administration used this democracy promotion agenda, both in the cases of Philippines and Thailand. So the details will vary between the two countries, but the overarching story was the same. Democracy was needed for economic development. After the 1997 financial crisis, I showed in the book that after the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the Thai and the Philippine government used that crisis to say that, look, we had this crisis, we need to open up and be transparent with our economic agenda. And that's how the United States provided loans to the Philippines and Thailand. They said, okay, we're giving out you some loans, but you need to commit more to democracy. And I'm not saying that democracy was good in those parts during that time. What I'm just saying here was that that's how they were justified. And there were some improvements in human rights outcomes during that time.
Thank you. I think Yeji also has a question. Please go ahead.
First of all, thank you so much for the valuable introduction of your argument and book. I really think that the evaluation of an impact of Usaid, focusing beyond the material outcomes and including the political discourses and ideas, seems to indicate a lot for further academic stretches. And my question is that, was there a probable public backlash or animosity against the foreign or domestic government's public discourses? Because if I understood well, to mobilize the recipient country's resources, both the foreign and recipient governments should avoid the explicit mobilization efforts, which may even set limit to their convergent interest and prevent their the actual outcomes of their purposes. So, and especially if a recipient country's legitimacy is weak, according to your condition, there could be a stronger backlash from the public. And in this case, the attention in the international society may be aroused more, and international powers can also interrupt in selective repressions according to, in the subsequent process of your theory. So eventually this may affect the human rights in a positive direction or affect the initial purposes of convergent interests of both governments. So to sum up, I wanted to ask if there was a consideration or inclusion of the probable public backlash against the explicitly revealed purposes of both countries while during the procedures of your theory. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for the question. This is an important point, particularly about. Sorry, can I answer the question, or shall we?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. So so public backlash. This is a very important point. Indeed, there was a lot of public backlash, and this public backlash methodologically is also one of the empirical attributes that one can say that, look, the Arroyo government and the Thaksin government had had very low levels of legitimacy given certain sectors in their respective countries. The public backlash can be seen through a lot of activists, student activists, protests here and there. I discussed this heavily in the book. Can you imagine, for example, in the case of the Philippines, at least for the purposes of this presentation, right? Even so, University of the Philippines, which is the major public university in the Philippines, this is generally a left-leaning university. And what happened was that even student activists were forcibly disappeared. When I say forcibly disappeared, they just literally disappeared. Can you imagine happening that in Korea? I'm sure it will be extremely horrible, right? And that's public backlash. A lot of journalists were being prosecuted. There were also a lot of harassment against journalists, physical harassment, and you can see that this is the precursor right now. There's backlash against the current government, but you can also see a lot of fake news coming out in order to fight the backlash, at least online. So the backlash was a very important aspect of the story that I offer in the book. And I call this as part of this, complex repertoire of contentious politics. People are against intensified state violence. There was no program for economic development. And the backlash was very much predominant both in Manila, but also in the peripheral provinces.
Well, thank you. Then Jihyun, now it's your turn to ask a question.
Thank you. Professor, thank you for your interesting presentation. I really enjoyed reading the first chapter that was sent to us via email, especially with the fact that you use a multi-level theory, seeing the interaction between extranational and domestic actors. I think it's the ideational factors that you pointed out, using the discourses and ideas vis-a-vis the material conditions. I have a question about this term, this concept. About these discourses and ideas, are they actually limited to when the foreign aid is actually being negotiated, or after when the aid is received, it's given afterwards? Because with the example that you have mentioned about President Aroy with her uses of aid, she actually used them to strengthen her legitimacy of her government, but it actually resulted human rights deterioration of the whole overall human rights situation. So with those results, are there any other discourses that is going on related to the results as well? So yeah, so I wanted to ask if you can explain a little more about this ideational factor, what kind of discourse are you talking about with your theory and with your book? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is an important question, right? So I argue that the strategic localization as an ideational mechanism is an ongoing process, right? But it is a process that first, in terms of who are these actors involved, if that's the question, at least one of the questions, it involves donor and recipient governments, but initially the recipient government. So before aid is received, the recipient government makes an active effort in Washington, D.C. to receive that aid. And this is a very important aspect of the story, because if you look at all the recent foreign aid stories that you would read, both written by my colleagues in political science or IR or sociology, but also economists, that missing piece, that piece of, so what do the recipient actors do? They are missing in the story. The United States is not out there looking for people who's going to receive their foreign aid. There are historical relationships that the United States does, but it's not going to say, do you need a lot of foreign aid? No, it doesn't. Right? Prospective recipient countries make an active effort. They hire lobbyists and all that. If you look, for example, during the Trump administration, Shinzo Abe of Japan made a lot of, he made sure that Japan is on Trump's agenda through other types of influence beyond the formal governmental influence. And that's why Shinzo Abe was the first Asian leader who was in Trump's mansion during 2016, because prospective countries make an active effort. So once their interests partially converge, I argue that this strategic localization happens before as well as during the use of foreign aid. And that is important because even though you might think that the Arroyo government is abusive, it still needs a lot of justifications to make sense of how foreign aid plus domestic resources are being used, because it still needs to communicate both to its opposition, so those opposing sectors of the society, but also to its crucial sectors that are supportive to its regime. So the strategic localization is an ongoing active process, primarily initiated by the recipient government.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from the audience? Any other follow-up questions? Jihan, do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I have a follow-up question. Actually, so yes, during and while while preparing for the foreign aid, yes, there can be a lot of discourse, and I totally agree with the explanation and with the idea that there will be discourses during and also before the foreign aid. But what my question was, when the aid is given, so afterwards, when all the discourse, all the strategic actions are over, so when the aid is given, after that, are there any more discourses between the donor and recipient country related to that foreign aid and the usage? That can, because the whole human rights situation happens after they receive those aids. So I was actually curious whether there is other discourses or ideation ideas that are going in between them after the aid is given.
Absolutely. It was happening, the discourses were fairly consistent on the part of the Arroyo regime. So I showed a while ago the statement from 2004, and I have a lot of other examples in the book itself, but it was fairly consistent. The discourse was that United States give a lot of this aid so that we crush all forms of armed rebellion. But at the same time, Arroyo did not only target armed rebellion, but she also argued that all those student activists, critical opposition members are part of the communist armed rebellion. So in the Philippines, we have two, right? So you have the armed Islamic groups, and we also have the longest running communist armed rebel group. So the New People's Army. So she was very consistent with that. And that statement happened, that statement that I provided was in 2004, 2 years after foreign aid was used. So I have all these statements across the years from late 2001 until 2009 for Arroyo and also Taksin. And it was important during that ongoing process. And even if there are human rights abuses already happening and critics, the Arroyo government and Taksin said, like, yeah, it's important. They are all linked to the armed Islamic rebel group. Of course, I'm making simplifications here because the details are in the manuscript. But what I argue here is that they use this overarching militaristic agenda, this militarism as a paradigm, right? So basically, what the question here is that, so what is the overarching theme of that discourse? It is about militarism. Anything against me as the leader, it should be, I need foreign aid plus domestic resources to crush you. It was ongoing, fairly consistent until the end of the term. Even if there's a lot of public backlash, the leaders were saying, we need this. They even call this neutralization campaign, which is a euphemism for basically killing civilians.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I think we have another question from Tegan.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Like, it was a wonderful presentation, and like beyond the substantive like contents, I wanna ask about the research method. So like in your contribution, like on the third part, you said that your method, your causal mechanism distinguished from previous quantitative studies, like in the way that previous quantitative studies have systematically ignored some important point, important causal story. So like how your research method like overcomes like these kind of limitations, and what were the like limitations of previous quantitative studies? Like I want to hear more about this point. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I'm primarily a qualitative scholar, although I would say that, well, when I was a PhD student, I think some of the listeners here are graduate students. So I think this is also interesting. So when I was a graduate student many years ago, two of my dissertation committee members were constructivists. One is a former student of Alexander Wendt at Chicago, Solora Viola, and Thomas Risse, who's one of the leading European constructivists. The other one was Susan Hyde, who is much more experimental, who does experimental political science and quantitative, right? My orientation is really the fact I really focus on, although I'm a primarily qualitative scholar, I argue that the questions dictate what kind of methods we are going to use. That has been my underlying motto. I mean, you don't go to a doctor, and if the doctor's favorite method is surgery, the doctor will not give you surgery as a prescription for a simple headache, just because the doctor's favorite method is surgery, right? So in the question that I ask here, does foreign aid undermine human rights? If so, how? I felt that one of the key contributions here is to understand the nitty-gritty details and to conceptualize what are those mechanisms that link between foreign aid and human rights. And you can do that, one ways of doing that. And I'm not saying perhaps that the only way to do that is through comparative historical analysis, which what I did here in the book, but one of the most effective ways that we can do that is to look into a simple subset of cases which fairly share a similar set of conditions, a set of similar conditions, and look into those domestic processes and how those domestic processes linked with transnational conditions such as United States foreign policy. My main contribution here is that if you just look into the last 10 years of foreign aid in last 10 years of literature on foreign aid, they are mostly written by development economists. To some extent, you also have sociologists and IR scholars, but a lot of these are quantitatively done. And I do believe that quantitatively oriented scholarship is very important, but I'm interested on the details and how we can theorize what are those mechanisms. And I believe that the literature ignored what are those causal mechanisms. I also have my own criticisms of mixed methods, but that could be in another method seminar. But for that, I would say that it's a predominantly quantitative literature.
Okay, thank you. If there are no more questions, I'd like to ask the final question. So I really enjoyed your presentation, and I wanted to ask broader implication of your theory and whether you think it's also applicable to other cases. So although this research is specifically about the US foreign aid, I was wondering whether you think this dynamic could be also observed in other contexts. So I think you have also worked on the foreign aid of other countries like Chinese foreign aid. So I'm wondering under what conditions like we would see this strategic convergence of donors and recipients, and other than this example of counterterrorism, like what kind of like strategic convergence we would observe in other contexts other than the United States.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very important question, and I think this is a nice segue for concluding. There are a lot of implications of this, and I discussed this in the final part of the book. I think an interesting for some of you who might be interested, I also look into the impact of US aid in Colombia. So the overarching story here is that it might not be wise to provide foreign aid that is militaristic in nature, right? Counterterrorism in nature, to a government that has a very weak legitimacy. I think that's a simple story. It sounds very simple, but it is, I think, a very powerful insight, because once you give a militaristic form of foreign aid to a very weak recipient government, it is likely to be used for intensified state violence, not only of armed groups, right? Which is, I argue, to be a perfectly legitimate aim or objective of any government. It doesn't want any armed rebel group contesting its legitimacy, but particularly for any form of legitimate political opposition. So that's the first one. I think not only for the United States, but also perhaps, I mean, South Korea is a very important donor country. I mean, even for a lot of Southeast Asian countries. So it might not be wise, but obviously that's not the only reason why aid is being used. There are foreign aid is being used for a lot of reasons. So we cannot just tell Seoul, for example, or Tokyo or Washington, D.C., please give foreign aid if you only have a strongly legitimate recipient government. That's the first. The second is that I think foreign aid in the long term should also invest on the long-term professionalization of the judiciary, as well as the coercive apparatus, police and military officers. I think number one, there's a very big literature on corruption in the police and the judiciary, which I will not talk about it in this presentation, but I think I would argue that foreign aid should also complement efforts to professionalize those branches of the state. If you have a judiciary judges which are lowly paid, right, it's easy to bribe them. If you have military and police officers who are paid with the minimum wage or very minimal amount of wages, then why would these police officers risk their lives for the state in protection of the human rights of citizens? Anyone can buy them. So any foreign aid agenda should look into the integration and the embedding of human rights in their professionalization programs. I just want to give an example for Colombia. I mean, the Colombian case, it's so far from Southeast Asia, but I saw the same dynamic here. In Colombia, the foreign aid was used as an incentive for military and police officers. So the more that you kill, the more incentives that you have if you're a military officer. So what they did in Colombia was that they dressed up thousands of hundreds of indigenous peoples in the Amazons. So you put them in a truck. This sounds very morbid. You put them in a truck and then you actually dress them up as if they are indigenous, as if they are rebels. And the Colombian military officers killed them. And they were registered eventually as, in Spanish, we call it falsos positivos. And there was, in fact, a US congressional investigation for that. Can you imagine that happening? So this is the problem with foreign aid. It is a big bang of resources that can be used for state violence. So I think there's a lot of lessons here, but I do think we have to rethink on how aid is being used and for what purpose. And that purpose is about the ideas that underpin them.
Thank you. That was a really insightful concluding remark. So I would like to thank Professor Regilme again for being with us today. And I also thank everyone for participating in the seminar and asking a really great question. So thank you. And we all look forward to ordering your book and reading the book.
Thank you so much,
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Bye. Have a good
Bye.
weekend to all
When
of
it
you.
will be published?
It will be released in November 9.
Good, great.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Keep in
Thank you
touch.
so much, professors and
Thank you.
students. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.